Thank you very much. This talk has basically two parts. As what was announced, it's an innovative language learning project called Language Accelerator. But I'd like to first of all speak in the first half of this talk on my motivation for being interested in this. It's because of the situation of the Irish language in Ireland. The language, as you know, is a Celtic language. It's one of the Gaelic languages, so it's Scottish Gaelic and the Isle of Manx, the language of the Isle of Man. But it's sometimes referred to as Gaelic, which is inaccurate. It's like calling English Germanic. English is one of the Germanic languages, but you wouldn't say, well, President Trump, how long have you been speaking Germanic? In the same way, Gaelic is Irish is one of the three Gaelic languages, but the normal way to refer to it in English is the Irish language. The Irish Constitution, for instance, Article 8 of the Constitution simply says that Irish, as the national language, is the first official language, or the principal official language, and English is recognised as another official language. Now, as you know, those of you who have been to Ireland, English is very much the majority language, but Irish is the ancestral language of most people in Ireland. It's a language which gives meaning to place names and to surnames in the whole island of Ireland and in most parts of Scotland. Well, for instance, Dublin comes from Irish Dubhlin, means literally black pool. Dubh is black, pool is a lin, or an Irish name like Kennedy, President John F. Kennedy. In Irish it's O'Cinneide. Literally it means ugly head. One final example, you've heard of the name O'Sullivan. In Irish it's O'Sullivan, it means one eye. So the ancestor of the O'Sullivans was a one-eyed chieftain. Getting down to just a little anecdote, first of all, maybe to begin with. One of the greatest scholars of Old Irish, the classical Irish of the 7th and 8th centuries, was Swiss Professor Rudolf Tourneisen. He wrote his Grammatik des Altirischen, and over 900 pages, a detailed grammar of Old Irish, but he wrote it in German. So it meant that for a whole generation, any Irish people who wanted to study the Old Irish language, the language of the 7th and 8th centuries, had to begin by learning German, because there was no textbook of Old Irish in either Irish or English. The only textbook was German. Eventually they did produce an English translation. But there was a story told that Professor Tourneisen, when he died, his funeral was attended by his very good friend, an Irish professor, Osborne Bergen. And as the coffin was being lowered into the grave, Professor Bergen looked at the inscription on the coffin, which was in Old Irish. Then he raised his eyes to heaven and he said, "Oh my God, 11 mistakes." Some of you may never have heard the Irish language, and there's an impression among people who haven't been to Ireland, who haven't heard Irish, that it's in some way related to English, or it's like a dialect of some kind of English. In fact, it's more distant from English than Slovenian is from German. So it's a completely different structure. I'll say a few words about that later on, but perhaps just to give you an idea of how it sounds, I'm not a very good singer, but I'd like to just sing a song. It's called Éimeanach. It's from 1690, over 300 years ago. It's probably an ancestor of mine. My name is Seán Ó Riain, and this was written by Éimeann Ó Riain, Éimeanach. He took the wrong side in the War of the Two Kings, when King James, the Catholic King James, and the Protestant King William fought for the crown of England, and they had their battles in Ireland in 1690. Éimeann Ó Riain was a landowner. He took the wrong side. He backed the Catholic King James. The Protestant King William won the war, which meant that Éimeann Ó Riain lost all of his land, was declared an outlaw, and was to being hunted down by English soldiers. And in the song he calls to a house, he calls to his girlfriend's house, but she is terrified to open the door, because she says that, well, the English are shooting at you, and if I open the door and help you in any way, they'll probably shoot both of us. So he turns away sadly, and he said that I'll have to probably leave the country, because there's no future for me in Ireland anymore. The other side has won, and we have to accept this. So this is what it sounds like. Again, I apologize if my voice sounds a bit odd. It might give you some idea of what the language sounds like, because it's a slow song. First of all, two reasons really to sing this song. It's a slow song, so you can hear the sounds quite clearly. And secondly, there was an Irish patriot in the 19th century, Thomas Davis, who said that he wrote on one occasion that he didn't mind who wrote the laws of the country on condition that he could write the songs. And in writing his songs, he wrote several songs. He had more of an effect, a political effect on public opinion than any of the laws in Ireland. One of his songs, called "The Nation Once Again," it won a competition in the year 2000 by the BBC as the most popular song ever. The BBC ran a competition, people could write in, nominate one song, and the Irish worldwide in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, organised themselves, and the winning song was a song in English, but an Irish rebel song called "The Nation Once Again," that was written by Thomas Davis. But to come back to a song in Irish, Éimeanach, it's "Ned of the Hill" or Éimeanach. Céishin namu a bhfuil fuair a reba magarish húnta mi sé éimeanach a tá baite fuarfleach ó hir hiúl sléite is gleánta a leigil sa chud cad a dheanghing se chud mar gairin art bang de magúna scuil púdar go tiobh a hir héide leat is go meiste réan múchta sfada mise a mú feich nachtas feichjuk skandánachta gom réineach má heisrach gan scor má vranar gan cor is gan iad gom in échar níl carid a gom is danid liamsan ach lacach liamach na dénach is go gahi medal ar farigasir os aun na fulean dem ghaelta. Thank you very much. When Ireland became independent almost a century ago, 1922, the first decision of the first Irish government was not to do with finance or with agriculture or with fisheries. It was to do with language. It was that all Irish children in primary schools and secondary schools should study Irish for at least 1 hour per day. Now, at the time that decision was taken, 80% of teachers did not know Irish. So it was quite a difficult decision to implement. But teachers weren't given much choice, and the decision was taken in February, and teachers were simply informed that you, if you wish to continue as a teacher, you will be teaching Irish as and from the 1st of September this year. How you learn it, where you learn it, and what method you manage to learn it is your own business. Just make sure you're in a position to teach the language from the 1st of September. My own father was one of the products of this situation, because he had a teacher who was middle-aged at the time of Irish independence, and the teacher was always about 2 pages ahead of the pupils. So you can imagine my father didn't learn that much Irish, but however my mother was a few years younger, and when she went to school, everything was done through Irish in school. She learned her history, geography, geometry, algebra, everything through Irish. So she became a fluent speaker of the language. My father, unfortunately, didn't. He always emotionally supported the language, but he could never speak it. For quite a number of reasons. It's as you've heard, the pronunciation is very different from English. The word order is different. It's a verb, subject, object language. You begin with the verb, not with the subject. Most Western European languages begin with the verb, begin with the subject, then you have the verb, then the object. Irish, on the other hand, similar to Semitic languages, similar to Arabic, it begins with the verb, then you have the subject, and then you have the object. So, she saw me, in Irish would be chonig, she, me. Chonig is saw, she, same as in English, and me, me. That's one difficulty. Then you have syntactical difficulties. There was no verb to have in Irish. There are effectively 3 verbs to be. There is the ser and the estar distinction, as in Spanish. So like Soy irlandés, I am Irish, would be is nach me. We use the verb is. I'm tired, you would say tá tisharum, like está in Spanish, tá in Irish. Tá tisharum is permanent and temporary condition, because tá tisharum, hopefully I'm not always tired. And then it also has the distinction in Slavic languages. I'm not sure if this occurs in Slovenian, but it does occur in Polish between jestem and bywam. Like jestem dzisiaj, bywam codziennie. I am now and I am every day. In Irish, you would say for I am now time, and for I am every day beam. So there's another form of the verb beam. This was more than an academic matter for us when we were children, because I grew up in a part of Ireland, in Tipperary, which had become English-speaking, but it had become English-speaking only 2 generations earlier. So the English we spoke was heavily influenced by Irish. And when the Irish began to speak English, they felt there was a lack in the English language. That if he is now is the present, well then, what do you say for he every day? It didn't seem right to him to say he is now and he is every day. So they made up this new form in English, he does be, I do be and he does be. Every time as a child I said I do be in school, I was beaten, physically slapped. And as a 6-year-old child I asked, well, why am I being beaten? Everybody speaks like that. And he said, no, children in England do not speak like that. And I replied, but I'm not an English child. I couldn't understand why I was being punished. Later, with much study, I discovered the background to all of this, and that we were speaking English. English had become the majority language in Ireland, but in a real sense, it was never ours. Even though it was the majority language, even though several Irish spoke English and nothing else, we were always conscious that it came from next door. It came from England, not from Ireland. It would never fully be ours. I mean, James Joyce, one of the best writers in English in the 20th century, had an argument once with an English dean, and he wrote afterwards that the language in which we are speaking is his before it is mine. My soul frets in the shadow of his languages. I have not made nor accepted its words. So this feeling of discomfort with the use of English is very common in Ireland, up to the present, certainly among those who are linguistically conscious. Then 2 other factors. One is the absence of Irish in everyday life. In most of the country, you don't hear the language. Outside of the western seaboard, where Gaeltacht areas, where it's still just everyday spoken language, are in the capital, where you have a lot of speakers at this stage, a lot of all Irish schools. You don't hear it in a lot of Ireland, so not hearing the language makes it particularly difficult to learn. It's associated with school only. Strangely enough, there was a bishop who decided that in Dublin, the greater Dublin area, where there were 3 or more masses every Sunday, one of the masses should be in Irish. So you hear more masses in Irish in the capital in Dublin than in most of the country. The Irish language services, Mass, for instance, is in the west, the Irish-speaking areas are in Dublin. But in between, there's a lack of the language. Finally, the all-Irish schools, what are called Gaelscoileanna, have grown. They're a small minority. They've grown in the past 30 years from about 2% to 8%. So still a small minority, but 4 times more numerous than they were. They're now in every part of Ireland, every county of the whole island of Ireland, not north and south, in all parts. In fact, they're growing in Northern Ireland and Belfast and faster than in the south. So it's a new movement. But in the Irish medium schools, the Gaelscoileanna, all children, up 97-98%, become really fluently bilingual. In the English medium schools, the other 92%, only about 30% reach the targets in Irish. Up to 70% study Irish for 12 years and do not reach the targets. They're not able to put 2 or 3 sentences together in Irish without making mistakes. And this has a very negative effect on them, not only as regards Irish, but as regards language learning in general. They become convinced. They say that, well, if I study the language for 12 years and I can't speak it, this is proof that I have no talent for language learning. Therefore, I won't even try to learn French or German or Polish or Spanish or anything else, because I've been 12 years learning Irish and I still can't speak it. So it's an entirely negative situation. Into this breach, I've spent a lot of my lifetime wondering as to how on earth we could get around this speech, because we have a small minority in Ireland, kind of born polyglots, those who learn languages easily, who become very fluent in Irish. And it's become a kind of elitist language in that sense, that those who have had a lot of education, who have studied a lot, tend to speak it, and those who have studied little, rarely if ever speak it. So it's become associated in this way with education. But in the searching for various ways of trying to improve it, I came across what they call the propedeutical method, the use of something simpler to improve something more complex. I came across the language Esperanto, which some of you may be familiar with. The language, it's in some ways controversial, but what I found interesting about it is it's basically, it's extremely regular. This little card I carry around in my pocket, this is basically all the grammar you need to use this language. It's on one side of a card. Professor Wim Janssen of the University of Amsterdam, he gave basically 5 reasons why Esperanto could be, and I mean a limited amount of Esperanto, would be useful in a propedeutical sense in preparing people to learn other languages. He said first of all, it's regularity. Second, it's transparency. All nouns end in O, all adjectives in A, all infinitives in I, all the adverbs end in E. So you can tell from the ending what function a part of speech has in a sentence. Lack of exceptions to grammatical rules. The culture of the Esperanto-speaking community subsumes contributions from many other cultures. And lastly, the language is not intended to impose particular models of thought and societal organization as other languages do. Now, basically, those who have looked at it will find this of a lot of interest, but there are many who look at Esperanto just on the surface. They take a quick glance at it and say it looks like a mixture of Western European languages, and they don't look any further. It looks like an inflected Indo-European language. Those who look that far and no further miss the essential point. There are 2 other levels of the language which we're looking at. Going to the second level, B level, it's an agglutinative language. It's more like Hungarian or Turkish. In other words, that more complex words are made up by the addition of simpler syllables. To give an example, for a hospital, you say malsanuleo. Sana is healthy, malsana the opposite. Ulu a person, eo for a place. So place for person is not in health. Basically, malsanuleo, inetso is femininity, bonetso, goodness. But the most important level, the bottom level of the language, it's more akin to Mandarin Chinese and to Vietnamese in being an isolating language in the sense that morphemes are invariable. They can combine with each other limitlessly, and they can also be used as independent words. This is something that you have in no Indo-European language. For instance, the Chinese expression, which means let the father act as a father and let the son act as a son, can in Esperanto be expressed in the 4 words of the original Chinese. It's patro, patru, philo, philu, because each part of speech can be a noun, a verb, an adjective, depending simply by changing the ending. For those who haven't studied it, it's really difficult to understand how incredibly easier, how much easier it is. That it's not just a little easier. I would say that it's about 10 times easier than most other languages, because that 1 month of Esperanto is about a year of it, like a year of English or a year of French. Just to give, very quickly, to give a couple of examples of this. The word, in English, for instance, you learn the word cold, but that's an adjective. You can't make a verb of cold. You have to say cool for a verb. You have words like lukewarm, warm, hot, tepid, to heat, and to cool. You need to learn each of those by heart. Simply, that nothing in each of the words shows you that they're related to the other words. The Esperanto equivalent of that, cold is malvarma. Varma is the root of warm, varma. Then lukewarm, malvarmeta. Cool is marvarmeta, lukewarm, varmeta. Hot, varmega. To heat something, varmigi. To cool, malvarmigi. So the same endings are used again and again. The other example is for animals, for instance. In English, a horse, a mare, a foal, and a stallion. French, cheval, étalon, jument, a poulain. A German, Pferd, Stute, Hengst, Fohlen. In each of those 3 languages, the 4 words are related in meaning, but there's nothing in the words which show that they're related to the other words. The Esperanto equivalent of that, a horse is cevallo, a mare, the feminine, is cevellino, because all feminine endings in ino gives you the feminine of everything. A foal, the young, is chevalido, and again, ido is the young of all animals all the time. And the stallion is vir chevallo, the masculine, the male is vir, beginning with vir. Another factor is that you can form adjectives from every noun very easily, simply by changing the ending. In English, we've got, say, father and paternal. In Esperanto, just patro, patra. In English, you have brother and fraternal. Esperanto, frato, frata. In English, you have uncle, the adjective avuncular. Esperanto, again, just onclo, oncla. And finally, just two more, a horse and equine. The adjective a horse, equine. Esperanto, chevalo, chevala. Or a cow and bovine. Bovino, bovina. And it's the same for everything. I mean, an ant in Esperanto is oclino. And unclina is the adjective. I'm not sure if there's any English adjective the equivalent of that, but it's unclina in Esperanto. So, I mean, in some ways you can come upon words quite easily and regularly, which are difficult to find even in your first language. The final example is to take a verb like in English to eat. You have eat, a meal, food, dining room, cutlery, edible, to nibble, to guzzle, and hungry. The number of different roots, different words you have to learn, each of those you learn by heart. And none of the words show that they're related to the other words. You simply have to learn it by heart. So you learn a lot of endings by heart. The Esperanto equivalent of this, it's all based on one root. To eat is mangi, a meal, manjo, food, mangiajo, dining room, mangeo, cutlery, mangiloi, edible, mangebla, to nibble, mangeti, to guzzle, mangiaci, and finally, hungry, mangema. So basically all based on one root, which is modified as needs be. Now, the final point I wanted to make is the Language Accelerator project. This should be the main point of the talk. It's a project which has begun at the beginning of this year in Zagreb. It's financed by the Erasmus Plus EU program. And the idea is to use a limited amount of Esperanto, basically the 250 most common morphemes, plus the basic grammar of the language, not as an end in itself, but to improve language learning in general. Now, there are 3 primary schools involved. There are a number of universities in Germany and here in Slovenia and in Denmark, Slovakia. There are primary schools one in Zagreb, one here in Slovenia, one in Bulgaria. There are 5 teachers involved and about 40 pupils. And so far it's been going very well. I've been keeping in touch with because some of my friends are very much involved in this project, but it's progressing well because the aim of the children is not, as in common language courses, you teach 1,000 or maybe 2,000 words, and you produce a passive knowledge of the language. Many people who study languages in this way can recognize a lot of the language, but they have very little speaking capacity in the language. This other course is, it has 2 revolutionary features. One is the use of a very limited amount of Esperanto, purely the most commonly used, the most frequently used morphemes only. And it's used for children of 8 or 9, the end of primary school children. Normally, teaching children of that age, there's a tendency to give the words for animals that you can draw and use drawings, which is an interesting method. The problem is that the animals you draw, like giraffe or elephant, are not commonly used words. You're learning words which afterwards are rarely, if ever, used. Many of us can go through a whole day without mentioning the word giraffe or elephant or wolf or whatever the animal that is drawn. Whereas words like can, might, must, maybe, wanted to, will, couldn't, these are used all the time for every kind of speech, for every kind of communication. So this course, this Language Accelerator course, concentrates on the most frequently used structures and words, and not just on passive recognition. It concentrates on getting the children to speak from the beginning, to actually use the word, so that they use, and for real communication as early as possible, not simply reciting sentences by rote to master a grammatical element, but to actually use the speech for real communication. This is something which has been lacking in Ireland. We spent so many years teaching grammar and teaching poetry and literature, and several people in Ireland can recite huge amounts of poetry, but they cannot speak the language. We had a poet, W.B. Yeats. His whole lifetime he wanted to speak Irish. He learned masses of poetry off by heart. He could recite 20 pages of prose in Irish by heart. He still couldn't speak the language, because basically his problem was he was afraid to make mistakes. He was trying to avoid making mistakes, but making mistakes, it's an inevitable part of learning languages. We all make mistakes, and it's a part of learning. If we want to avoid making mistakes, we never achieve fluency. For instance, I spent 5 years in our embassy in Poland. I learned to speak Polish with a lot of difficulty. In the beginning, I made lots and lots of mistakes. I mean, for about 3 months, I spoke English to the local staff who had very good English. But then I decided that I will never learn Polish if I'm speaking English in work every day. So I asked them to please speak Polish to me all the time at work. And let's try and use Polish all the time. For about 2 months, I went through hell, basically, because I got all the endings wrong. I said all kinds of weird things. I can still remember one bit slightly amusing point. It was after a day's work. We were having a chat around a cup of coffee, and in Polish, of course. And at this stage, I could follow most of the Polish, but I couldn't speak very much, so I wanted to say something in Polish. They were talking about children, and I just wanted to say a simple sentence. I wanted to say that my sister had twins 4 years ago, so I thought out the sentence, made it up in my mind, but I was very tired after a full day's work. So when I came out, I said, 4 lata temu moje siostry miała, and that, I should have said, of course, bliźniaki, but I said bliźniaki, jak może ziemniaki. So basically what I said was 4 years ago my sister had potatoes. This was never forgotten, this particular mistake, and it's a mistake I haven't made since then. I haven't mixed up bliźniaki and ziemniaki since then. But it shows that in order to learn languages, we really need to use them. And for donkey's years, my PhD was in language policy in Ireland. And the kernel point of this was, Irish language policy is often regarded as a complete failure because the country speaks mainly English. That's a bit like the iceberg. What you fail to see is that about 40% have a reasonably good understanding of Irish. But because they speak English better, you don't hear the Irish. It's hidden away. This has been tested by empirical experiments from time to time. For instance, once the Irish Times, the main newspaper in Dublin, which is normally just in English, on one occasion they had a page, about once a week they publish a page completely in Irish. But in the middle of a page, in the middle of an article, they put in a sentence in Irish, just a little paragraph in Irish saying, if you're reading this and you can understand it, please call round to the Irish Times office and you'll get a free T-shirt. Thousands of people turned up, to such an extent that after a couple of hours they had no more T-shirts. So the following day they had to publish in English on the first page, please stop calling to the office looking for T-shirts, we have no more T-shirts. So it was the proof that far, far more people were reading this and far more people understood it than you would ever hear in Dublin. Walking in the streets of Dublin, you could spend 6 months living in Dublin and never hear Irish spoken in the street. So didn't you assume that, well, nobody ever speaks this language? It's, as I mentioned, it's like the iceberg. The amount of passive knowledge of the language is hidden. And the TG Car, the program, which the TV channel in Irish, does have quite over 800,000 people watch it at some of the time. So there is a real knowledge, and the fact that parents of their own accord are founding new all-Irish schools, and this has been going up, it shows that there is a far more greater knowledge of the language than I was imagining. So to come back to the Language Accelerator project, I had 2 daughters. I'm bringing them up through Irish. I spoke only Irish to them. They're now 25 and 22. They speak Irish fluently. I speak nothing but Irish to them. But I arranged that they would learn Esperanto not as a second language, but as a 5th language. My wife is French speaking, so they spoke French and Irish, first of all. They had English and German in school. They were in school in Berlin. And then I arranged that they would learn Esperanto as a 5th language. My wife opposed the idea, first of all. She said that I would support Esperanto as a second language, but our children already have 4 languages. Do you really think they need a 5th? And I said, well, here are some text, some children's books I got from China. I read a page out loud to them. They only had 1 new word. From their knowledge of French, of German, of English, they could already follow the Esperanto if it's spoken slowly and clearly. So I said with a tiny little extra effort, they will add an extra language. But they will not just add an extra language, they will deepen their understanding of grammar and grammar in general. Instead of kind of wondering what a participle is, some people go through life wondering what a past participle or a future passive participle is. They will suddenly recognize these words by the clear endings in this language, because it couldn't be anything else. If it's is, it's past tense. If it's a j, it's the plural. If it's onta, it's future active participle. Ota, future passive participle. Again, these regularity comes through and can be used to better understand the other languages. So I found this in practice, that both of my daughters said they were very happy to pick up this language. Again, some will say that we have all kinds of legends going around, that that it's artificial, that there is no original literature, there is no native speakers. All of these are false, and they're demonstrably false. Anybody can check that they're false by checking. But Claude Piron changed careers. He spent 20 years as a translator at the United Nations in New York, translating between English, French, and Chinese. But he changed careers. He became a psychologist because he met so many rational people who are normally irrational in making decisions. If they were buying a house or buying a car, they would make a rational decision. They'd say what the pluses and the minuses of a particular model of car, and they would make a rational decision. But when you mentioned the word Esperanto to them, suddenly rationality went out the window. They reacted emotionally. They said, no, Esperanto, no, it's an artificial language. It couldn't possibly work, and even if it does, it shouldn't. They had these huge, massive prejudices against it. They refused to check it. I've personally experienced this. A good friend of mine who was a German diplomat, I had breakfast with him in Berlin, and we had a good chat for about an hour over breakfast. And I said, by the way, if you're curious about how Esperanto sounds like, just across the road now there's a world conference of Esperanto with 3,000 people from 80 countries. You can just come across the road with me and listen to it. He said, absolutely no, I can't. It was some kind of a disease. He was afraid to go along in case he pick up the virus and become infected with this disease, and afterwards he could never get rid of it again. So I found this absolutely fascinating. As I mentioned, Claude Piron changed careers because of this. He's written many articles which you can find on the internet in several languages about this psychological phenomenon, the refusal of people to consider something. They have this idea, one of his ideas is that your mother tongue is learned with your mother's milk. You're a baby, you're born, you're hungry, you're tired, you scream and nothing happens because nobody can understand you. Then suddenly you learn one or two words. You learn milk or something. You shout milk and milk appears. It's like magic. All of a sudden things start to happen because you use one word. And because most of us learn this language as our mother tongue, we become fascinated by the idea of a mother tongue. And in some way it builds up within us a psychological resistance to the idea of what people say is an artificial language. This couldn't be, it's just not an unstarter. This whole idea of artificiality is fascinating because classical music, for instance, is written by one person. People don't describe classical music as artificial music. I've never yet heard somebody saying, I don't like artificial music, I much prefer the natural music produced by the birds. But for some reason, people, even knowledgeable people, linguists will say, Esperanto artificial, don't like it. Esperanto was artificial back in 1887. It's 5 generations ago. Since then, it has left the drawing board. I have a good friend of mine, the late Dr. Detlef Branker of the Humboldt University of Berlin. He did a PhD thesis on what he called auxiliary languages or planned languages. He examined over 900 of them, not just Esperanto, but languages like Ido and Volapük and Occidental and Interlingua, a whole list of these languages. But he came up with 28 stages from a language project written on paper to becoming a fully developed language with native speakers, poetry, original literature. He said Esperanto and only Esperanto has come the full 28 stages from a language project to being a fully developed language. It has developed its own community, and because of this, it's in every sense a real language. Now, the powers that be, the European Commission and our prime ministers, they may totally reject this and say, nonsense, this couldn't be true. But challenge them to check it for themselves. They will always find an excuse to avoid checking it for themselves. They will never come along with you to check it, because there's this fear that, oh, good God, what if these guys are right? Then we have to change everything if this is right. So it's easier to pretend that it's all wrong, it's all nonsense, and laugh it out, of course. I mean, the numbers we use now, Arabic numerals, they took several centuries to become common. They really came from, they could be called the Indian numerals, but they're normally known as Arabic numerals. But from several centuries, Roman numerals were in use in Europe. And Roman numerals had no zero. So you couldn't, mathematical calculations, even simple mathematical calculations were difficult. So you had to pay a mathematician to calculate for you. And then suddenly these new numerals appeared with a zero, and it became possible for everybody to calculate. But immediately the vested interests, the mathematicians, those who were being paid by the old system, they spread all kinds of rumors about these new numerals. They're involved in witchcraft, black magic, keep away from them, they're not good. And for several centuries, they managed to delay for several centuries the adoption of the numerals we now use. And by doing so, they maintained their monopoly, they maintained their system of power, where they had to be paid for doing calculations. And Roman numerals continued in use. In the same way today, Professor François Grain of the Economic University of Geneva, he published a study back in the year 2005 about the English language worldwide, and he discovered that the international position of the English language brings between 17 and 18 billion euros per year to the UK economy, and about 4% of that to my own country. So Ireland is also guilty in purposing this. This is like a tax. It's money which flows. It's over 3 times as much as North Sea oil, and it flows directly to people born in England or Ireland simply because they're born speaking this language. Everybody else in Europe, whether they're French or Spanish or German or Slovene or Slovak or Polish, they all pay to do English language courses, and they go to England or Ireland and to do courses in this language. But the whole idea of having something neutral is brushed out of court, is never given any kind of consideration. But that's a more general point. But to come back to the main point of this course, which lasts for 2 years, the Language Accelerator course, lasts just this year and next year. And the idea is to try to prove that these short courses on Esperanto can improve language learning in general. There's a problem with language learning in Europe in that the Eurobarometers, if you ask people, can they speak English, you get a lot of people, 38% say they have a good knowledge of English. Only 8% say they have a very good knowledge of English. So you're down to a smaller percentage, 8% of learners, of course, not counting UK or Irish native speakers of English. But when in 2012, the European Commission organized a scientific survey of languages called SurveyLang, where they actually give tests to people in about 12 European countries. And the results of this were fascinating because they showed, for instance, that in the Scandinavian countries and in Holland, the results in English as a first foreign language was sky high. You got 80, 90, high 90% having very good knowledge of English. But when you looked at the third language, any language in Sweden, for instance, it was down at the bottom again. That they have very good results for English, but English tends to take up all the time. So that then the next language, whether it be German or Spanish or French or whatever else it is, really it has very low results. And I attended a presentation of the SurveyLang results in the Commission for about 2 hours once, and I had one question at the end. I said they said that the testing was at the first 4 levels, or A1, A2, B1 and B2. They didn't test at the C1 or the C2 levels. Of course, my first question was, why did they not test at the C1 level? And the reply was, because those who reach the C1 level, even in their first foreign language, constitute a tiny minority in the region of 1%. So they didn't have any testing for the C1 level because of this. B2 was seen as the highest that learners can learn in any language. This Common European Reference Framework is used also for Esperanto teacher languages. They have exams, and more than half of those, the exams are B2 level and C1. Very many of those do the exam manage to succeed at the C1 level. I happened to succeed in it back in 2009, and it was a difficult enough exam. It took 4 hours of a written paper. So to sum up, at the end of next year, we should have a result on these three primary schools in Bulgaria, Croatia, and Slovenia to see if the 40 children involved improve in their learning, say, of English or German or whatever next language they choose after this short Esperanto course. And probably I've spoken more than enough at this stage, so I should leave a little time if there are questions or comments. Thank you for your attention.
Hi, my name is Luka. I'm from Croatia. At the beginning of your lecture, you mentioned that Irish word and English word for she are the same. Is it an English word loaned in Irish, or is it totally separate etymology?
An interesting question. It's a separate development. The Irish word for he is she, for instance, and the word for she. It's also the same word in Esperanto. So she is in Esperanto, she estas. Strangely enough, I discovered recently, because I attend conferences in Vienna at the United Nations, and we sit in alphabetical order. We have Iran, Iraq, Ireland, Israel. My Israeli colleagues tell me that the Hebrew word for she is he. That creates great confusion. And it's strangely enough, the Welsh word for she is he as well. So she is, in Irish she is, in Irish is tá she, in Welsh it's my he. And Irish he is tá she, and Welsh is my a. So it's not a loan word at all. It's just that the a is the masculine in Irish and the e is the feminine. And in this, I think it's entirely coincidental there that the same she in Irish, in English and Esperanto, it's exactly the same. Not written the same, but it is pronounced the same.
Hi, I'm Itzik from Israel. You've mentioned that Chomsky said that Esperanto is not really a language, that it's an artificial language. I think what he meant to say is that it's not connected to any culture or tradition or folklore or a region or country. Can you relate to this, please?
Yes, I've read of this, and it's interesting as well, because it shows how deeply nationalism has penetrated in our minds. Even those of us who do not consider themselves nationalist, we find difficulty in thinking of a culture which is not a national culture. We forget that we're all human beings, and we have a lot in common as human beings, because at the first conference of Esperanto ever held in 1905 in Boulogne-sur-Mer, Zamenhof wrote about this, saying that it was, for the first time, he said ever probably, you didn't have French meeting with English or Russians meeting with Poles. You had human beings meeting with human beings. Because this element is often forgotten. We do have a lot more in common than we realize. And we concentrate so much on what divides us. I grew up in an Irish nationalist tradition. We were regarded as the ignorant, the conqueror and the bad, and we learned all of the horrible things they did, the English dictator Cromwell and the massacres of the 17th century. So it took me a long time to come around this, to realize that English are human beings the same as we are, and we have a lot more in common with them, and that the regime which oppressed Ireland oppressed a lot of English people as well. And that today's English are not in any way responsible for what Oliver Cromwell did in Ireland in 1650. But to come back to Chomsky, yes, I've read about that. I think that is what he meant. That Chomsky, as far as I know, does not speak Esperanto, but I have many friends who speak it, and I even have some native speakers. There was a German ambassador, Ulrich Brandenburg. Not alone does he speak Esperanto fluently, he grew up speaking it. His father only spoke Esperanto to them. Both of his parents were German, they grew up in Münster. But his father only spoke Esperanto, and when they were children, his father pretended not to understand German or anything else. So it meant that the children had to translate everything into Esperanto. If there was a joke on the radio or television, the father would just look blank. So the children had to translate the joke into Esperanto, and then the father would laugh. He had a lot of self-discipline. But Ulrich told me that up to the time his father died, which is about the time I left Berlin in 2005, I had lunch with him, he said his father never spoke anything else to him except Esperanto. So in that case, it's no longer artificial. He said it's much more like a test tube baby. The test tube baby is artificial at the moment of conception, but then it develops into a baby, into a fetus. It's implanted in a uterus. It's born, and it becomes a child like any other child. You would never point at a 10-year-old child and say, "Look, an artificial child." In the same way, Esperanto it was born back in 1887. It was artificial in the beginning, but it has. The linguist Mario Pai once said that to call modern Esperanto artificial is like describing a motor car as an artificial horse.
Hi, I'm Juliana, I'm from Brazil. I was wondering if you could share any advice, any tip for accelerating learning, a part of learning Esperanto, please.
To learn Esperanto?
No. Apart of that, if you can share any advice, any tip accelerating learning, apart of learning Esperanto.
Oh, I would say that the most obvious thing is to use the language. Actually use it for real communication. Any language, that applies to any language. I have colleagues at the embassy who spend German courses in Vienna. They do German course after German course after German course, but they never ever use it at work. They're terrified that they could make mistakes and something will go wrong at work and they will get blamed for it. So therefore they speak only English at work and then they try to learn German. But that's like trying to fill a bathtub with no stopper. You're pouring water in one end and it goes out the other end. We've been doing this in Ireland for nearly a century. We've been teaching Irish to children for 12 years at school, but they never use it outside of school. It's teaching. They learn verbs, they learn irregular verbs, they learn a whole host of grammatical features, but they don't use it for real communication. The one area in Ireland where it is used for communication, in the army. Since independence, orders in the Irish army have been given in Irish and in Irish only. There, everybody can understand it and everybody follows the orders. I've never heard of a soldier who failed to understand Irish. Because once it becomes in real use, once the orders are given in Irish, and given only in Irish, so in other words, if you fail to understand it, then you'll be out of step, you'll be doing something that nobody else is doing. Once there's a real communicative need for the language, then you learn it, and then you use it. But I think usage and learning are intimately connected. There's a real mistake made that people say, well, you have to learn a language first, then you start using it. That's completely false. You need to learn a bit and then start to use that. And the bit you use helps you to learn more. And by learning more, you begin to use more again. That they're intimately, the usage and the learning are intimately connected. In Ireland, we're the perfect example of what not to do as regards languages, because when we became independent, we had a lot of younger people coming from the schools who were fluent in Irish. They joined the Irish service, the civil service, state service. They had bosses who were basically worked in the civil service when it was a colonial civil service, when it was run from London. The bosses didn't speak any Irish, and they found lots of ways to discourage their younger colleagues from using any Irish. In other words, in those days, it would never be put on paper, nobody would admit it officially, but if you spoke a lot of Irish or you were too enthusiastic about using Irish, you noticed that you didn't get promoted. And of course, they would never say you're not promoted because you're using too much Irish. They will find 1,000 other reasons for not promoting you. But the real reason was that the boss doesn't understand Irish. An increase in usage of Irish makes it uncomfortable for the boss. If the boss is uncomfortable, he finds hundreds of ways of discouraging those who are making life uncomfortable for him. And of course, he will always find a plausible excuse. So to come back to the language learning, outside of Esperanto entirely, the basic way to learn any language is to start to use it as soon as possible. If you only have a few words of it, just to use those words. And by using it, it becomes more solidified in your mind, and it improves, it speeds up the learning of it as well. But I must come back to that, to say that irregularities are more difficult. In Irish, it has just 11 irregular verbs. But those 11 irregular verbs are the most commonly used. The word to go, for instance, has 5 different parts. I'm going, tá mé dul. I went, chus. I didn't go, niachts. I will go, raime. I won't go, ni raime. These are all you 5 different roots for the one verb, the most common verb of going. So mastering these 11 verbs is a real problem. My children, for instance, would say, I saw chonik me. I didn't see niaka me. This chonik niaka is completely irregular. My children would regularize it. They would say, nir chonik. And I would say to them, that is not considered correct in Irish. Yeah, so you were thinking logically. If we were speaking in Esperanto, you would be correct. But we're not speaking in Esperanto, we're speaking in Irish, and the language is illogical. You as a child are thinking logically, but the language is illogical. In order to speak Irish correctly, you have to say chonik me, niaka me. So eventually they got it, and then they were quite proud of themselves. They'd say, niaka she. And they'd look at me kind of say, I got it right this time. But that's basically, as I say, if I had to put it all in one word, usage, use the language.
Seán Ó Riain, thank you very much.